The rain was a steady whisper against the glass, a soft, forgiving sound that tried to wash away the sin happening inside the quiet suburban house. In the guest room, another kind of whisper filled the darkness, frantic and breathless. Her fingers dug into his back, a desperate anchor in a rising tide of sensation and shame. The sheets were a tangled mess beneath them, a testament to a struggle that had long since surrendered to desire. "Ethan," Chloe breathed, her voice a fractured plea against his skin. "No, we should stop, Olivia." The name of her sister, his wife, hung in the air between them, a ghost at the feast. He paused, his body tense above hers, the full weight of their betrayal pressing down on him. But the scent of her, a mix of jasmine and warm skin, was an intoxicant, and the feeling of her moving beneath him was a current too strong to fight. "I know," he murmured, his voice thick and raw. "I can't. Not now, Chloe. Not now." He moved again, and her protest dissolved into a soft, helpless moan that he swallowed with a kiss. There was only the sound of the rain, the rustle of the sheets, and the muffled, rhythmic sounds of two people taking something that was never theirs to have, finding a desperate, fleeting paradise in the heart of their own private hell. It hadn't always been this way. It couldn't have been. 3 months ago, the loudest sound in this house was the evening news, and the most tangled the sheets ever got was from a restless night's sleep. 3 months ago, Ethan's life was a structure he had designed himself, as solid and predictable as the buildings he drafted as an architect. He loved his wife, Olivia. He loved their quiet dinners, the comfortable silence they shared, the easy rhythm of their 5-year marriage. But the rhythm had become a routine, and the silence, at times, felt empty. Olivia, a dedicated nurse, often worked long, grueling shifts, returning home exhausted, leaving a void in the evenings that Ethan filled with work and the low hum of the television. It was a good life, a stable life, but the colors had begun to fade to gray. The call came on a Tuesday. Olivia's face lit up in a way Ethan hadn't seen in months, her fatigue momentarily forgotten. It was Chloe, her younger sister, her voice bubbling with the excitement of a recent graduate. She wanted to move to the city to chase her artistic dreams, and she needed a place to stay, just for a little while, until she got on her feet. Olivia turned to him, her eyes hopeful. Of course, Ethan had said immediately, a warm, brotherly smile on his face. "She's family. Our home is her home." He felt a genuine sense of duty, of kindness. He would be the supportive brother-in-law, the stable presence in the young woman's new life. He had no idea he wasn't opening his home to his wife's sister, but to the woman who would dismantle his world, one whispered secret at a time. Chloe arrived on a Saturday, the kind of brilliant, sun-drenched afternoon that makes the suburbs feel almost idyllic. Her car, a beat-up blue hatchback from the late 90s, sputtered into the driveway, packed so tightly with boxes, canvases, and clothes that it looked like a tiny mobile storage unit. Ethan was in the front yard, trimming the hedges, the rhythmic snip of the shears, the only sound breaking the weekend quiet. He watched as the driver's side door creaked open and a pair of worn-out combat boots hit the pavement, followed by long denim-clad legs. He was expecting the Chloe he remembered from holidays and the wedding, a lanky, slightly awkward teenager with braces and a shy smile. The woman who emerged, however, was someone else entirely. She stretched, arching her back like a cat after a long nap, and pushed a pair of sunglasses up into a cascade of honey blonde hair. The sun caught in it, turning it into a halo. She was wearing a faded Ramones t-shirt and jeans that had more holes than fabric, but on her, it looked less like carelessness and more like a deliberate, artistic statement. When she saw him, her face broke into a wide, luminous smile, and the shy girl he remembered was gone, replaced by a woman who seemed to radiate an effortless confidence. "Ethan, you have no idea how good it is to see a friendly face," she called out, her voice clear and bright. He put down the shears and walked over, a genuine smile on his own face. "Welcome, Chloe. We were starting to think you got lost." He gave her a brief, slightly stiff hug, the kind reserved for extended family. He was immediately aware of two things: how slender she felt, and the scent of her hair, something clean and citrusy, like lemons and sunshine. It was a stark contrast to the familiar, comforting floral scent of his wife. He quickly stepped back, feeling a strange need to reestablish a comfortable distance. "Let me help you with this stuff," he said, his voice a little too loud. For the next hour, they moved her life from the tiny car into the quiet guest room at the end of the hall. The house, usually so orderly and calm, was suddenly filled with a new kind of energy. Her laughter echoed off the walls as she recounted stories from her road trip, and the scuff of her boots on the hardwood floors felt like a new, unfamiliar rhythm. Ethan found himself watching her, studying her. He noticed the way her t-shirt, old and soft, clung to the curve of her back when she bent over to lift a box. He saw the smudges of charcoal on her fingers, a permanent part of her, it seemed. He saw the concentration in her bright blue eyes as she directed him where to put her things. Each observation was filed away in his mind under the guise of simple curiosity. This wasn't the little sister-in-law he had to make polite conversation with. This was a person, a woman, with a life and a passion that felt intensely, vibrantly her own. While carrying a particularly heavy box of books together, their fingers brushed. A tiny spark, a brief jolt of static electricity, shot up his arm. "Sorry," she mumbled, her cheeks flushing slightly. "No, it's okay," he replied, his own voice sounding distant. He told himself it was just static, a dry day, nothing more. But the feeling lingered on his skin long after the moment had passed. Olivia came home from her shift just as they were finishing up, and the house filled with the sound of sisters reuniting. They fell into an easy, rapid-fire chatter, full of inside jokes and shared memories that Ethan wasn't a part of. He stood in the doorway, watching them, feeling a genuine warmth at the sight of his wife so happy. Olivia looked tired, the lines of her face etched with the stress of a 12-hour shift, but having Chloe there seemed to erase some of that weariness. He saw them as a pair, Olivia, the steady, responsible older sister, and Chloe, the free-spirited, artistic younger one. He was the husband, the brother-in-law, a stable fixture in their lives. The role felt comfortable, correct. Yet, as he watched Chloe playfully drape her arm around Olivia, he felt a strange, subtle pang. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was a feeling of being on the outside of a light source, able to appreciate its warmth, but not truly feel it on his skin. That evening, the guest room was transformed. What had been a sterile, impersonal space with a bed and a dresser was now Chloe's sanctuary. She had draped strings of fairy lights over the headboard, casting a soft, magical glow. Posters of obscure bands and art prints were tacked to the walls. Her books were stacked in precarious, artful piles, and the scent of turpentine from her painting supplies mingled with the lingering citrus of her perfume. Ethan found himself walking past the open door several times, drawn by the changes. She was humming to herself, unpacking a record player. It was a sound the house had never heard before. He leaned against the doorframe. "Getting settled in?" he asked. She looked up and smiled, trying to. "I feel like I brought way too much stuff." "Looks good," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "It feels alive." Her smile softened. "Thanks, Ethan. That's the nicest thing anyone said about my mess." He offered to help hang a large framed canvas, and for a few minutes, they worked in close proximity again. He held the frame steady while she hammered in the nail, his arm brushing against her shoulder. He was intensely aware of her breathing, of the warmth radiating from her body. He focused on keeping the frame level, on the task at hand, on anything other than the woman standing so close to him. At dinner, the new energy was palpable. The conversation, which for months had been a quiet exchange between him and Olivia about their respective workdays, was now a lively, three-way affair. Chloe talked animatedly about her art thesis, about her plans to find a studio space, about the light in the city, and how different it was from her college town. Ethan found himself completely captivated. He was used to conversations about hospital politics and construction permits, conversations grounded in the practical realities of their lives. Chloe spoke of color, of emotion, of capturing a feeling on canvas. It was a language he hadn't heard in years, and it was intoxicating. He watched the way her hands moved when she talked, painting pictures in the air. He noticed the way she bit her bottom lip when she was searching for the right word, a small, unconscious gesture that he found inexplicably endearing. He told himself he was simply enjoying the novelty, the break from their routine. Olivia was enjoying it too, laughing and asking questions, happy to have a piece of her past in her present. It all felt so innocent, so perfectly normal. Later that night, long after the sisters had gone to bed, their soft voices still a faint murmur from down the hall, Ethan sat alone in the living room's dim light. The house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was a silence that was now defined by the presence within it. He could almost feel her energy humming from the guest room, a low, vibrant frequency that had retuned the entire house. He looked at the framed photo on the mantelpiece, he and Olivia on their wedding day, smiling, their futures clear and bright. He had always looked at that photo with a sense of quiet pride and contentment. But tonight, for the first time, he felt a flicker of something else. A strange restlessness stirred in his chest, a vague sense of yearning for something he couldn't name. The fresh breeze had blown into his carefully constructed life, and he didn't yet realize that it carried the scent of a coming storm. The air was different now, charged with a new and dangerous possibility, and he had been the one to open the window. The first few weeks with Chloe in the house were a study in adjustment, a gradual weaving of a new thread into the familiar fabric of their lives. The novelty of her arrival soon settled into a new kind of normal. Her combat boots by the front door became as standard as Ethan's work shoes, and the scent of her jasmine shampoo became a permanent, sweet undertone in the upstairs hallway. Life found a new rhythm, one dictated by Olivia's demanding nursing schedule. She often left for the hospital while the sky was still a bruised, pre-dawn purple, and returned long after sunset, her energy spent, her stories full of the quiet emergencies and sterile anxieties of the ward. This created a vacuum, a vast, quiet space in the mornings and evenings that Ethan and Chloe, by default, began to fill together. It was in these quiet, shared moments that the subtle shift began. The almost imperceptible blurring of a line Ethan never thought would be anything but sharp and clear. The mornings were the most potent. Ethan, an early riser by habit, would come downstairs to the quiet kitchen to make coffee. More often than not, Chloe would already be there, or would wander in moments later, still lost in the soft fog of sleep. She was a different person in the morning. Her vibrant energy was muted, replaced by a quiet, unguarded softness. Her blonde hair would be a tangled mess, piled loosely on her head, and she'd be swimming in an oversized t-shirt that belonged to some forgotten college event, the soft cotton draping off one shoulder. Her long, bare legs, always a surprise, seemed to make the familiar kitchen feel smaller. Ethan would watch over the rim of his coffee mug as she stretched to reach the top shelf, the worn t-shirt riding up to expose the pale, gentle curve of her lower back. He would quickly look away, down into the blackness of his coffee, a hot flush of something he couldn't name prickling his neck. It felt like an intrusion, like seeing something private he wasn't meant to see. But the image would stay with him, a brief, vivid snapshot replaying in his mind as he drove to the office. Her presence became a sensory experience that infiltrated every corner of his home, of his mind. He'd walk past the bathroom after she'd showered, and a cloud of warm, jasmine-scented steam would drift out to meet him, a ghost of her presence that felt shockingly intimate. He'd sit on the sofa in the evening and find one of her stray sketchbooks, the pages filled with charcoal studies of hands, of faces, of the light falling on a bowl of fruit. He'd pick it up, his thumb tracing the gritty, black lines, feeling a connection to the way she saw the world. Sometimes, when the house was empty, he would stand in the doorway of her room, now a chaotic artist's den, and just breathe it in the smell of paint and paper and Chloe herself. He told himself it was just curiosity, a fascination with her creative life, so different from his own world of blueprints and right angles. But it was more than that. It was an obsession with the details of her, a cataloging of the small things that made her who she was. Their interactions were almost always innocent, brief exchanges over the breakfast counter, shared laughter at a late-night television show. Yet, the air between them began to feel charged, heavy with unspoken things. One afternoon, they were both in the kitchen, preparing their own separate lunches. He reached into the refrigerator for the mustard at the exact same moment she reached for the mayonnaise. Their hands collided in the cold air, his fingers brushing against the back of her hand. Her skin was surprisingly soft, and the contact, though fleeting, sent a jolt through him that was sharp and undeniable. "Oh, sorry," she said, pulling her hand back as if burned. "No, you go," he said, his voice sounding unnaturally formal. They both gave a short, awkward laugh, but the moment hung between them. For the rest of the day, He could still feel the phantom touch of her skin against his. His internal monologue became a battleground of observation and immediate, forceful denial. He'd find his gaze lingering on the shape of her lips as she sipped her tea, noticing the small indentation in the center of her top lip. She's Olivia's sister, his mind would scream, and he'd force himself to look away, to ask her a question about her job search, to make it normal. He'd noticed the graceful line of her neck when she tied her hair back to wash her face at the sink. She's just a kid, he'd counter, even though at 22 she was anything but. He started to feel a gnawing guilt that attached itself to everything. He found himself overcompensating with Olivia, greeting her at the door with an effusive hug, listening to her stories from the hospital with a desperate, focused attention. He was trying to be a better husband, to reinforce the walls of his marriage, but his efforts felt hollow, like a performance. The guilt wasn't making the attraction go away, it was just making it stronger, feeding it with the power of its secrecy. It was a secret he was still trying to keep, even from himself, rationalizing his thoughts away as loneliness, as boredom, as the simple, harmless appreciation of beauty. He was just being a good friend, a supportive brother-in-law. They were just friends. It was a mantra he repeated until the words themselves began to feel like a lie. The shift crystallized one warm evening toward the end of the month. Olivia was working a double shift, and a quiet stillness had settled over the house. Ethan was in his home office, trying to focus on a set of blueprints, but the lines on the page kept blurring. He glanced out the window into the backyard. Chloe was sitting on the grass, her back against the old oak tree, a sketchbook open in her lap. The setting sun filtered through the leaves, dappling her in a warm, golden light. She was completely absorbed, her brow furrowed in concentration, a piece of charcoal held delicately in her fingers. She was beautiful. The thought didn't come with an accompanying rationalization or a stab of guilt. It was just a simple, unvarnished fact, as solid and real as the desk beneath his hands. In that quiet, solitary moment, watching her from a distance, the roles of wife, sister, and brother-in-law dissolved. He was just a man, looking at a woman and feeling a profound, terrifying pull of desire. The subtle shift was no longer subtle. It was a definite tectonic movement beneath the foundation of his life, and for the first time, he could feel the ground beginning to tremble. The temptation, when it finally arrived, wasn't a dramatic, thunderous event. It came on a quiet Friday night, wrapped in the mundane and delivered by the insistent beep of Olivia's pager. She had been looking forward to this night all week, a rare shift that was supposed to end at 7, promising a quiet dinner and a movie together. But a major accident on the interstate meant all hands on deck at the hospital. She called, her voice weary and apologetic, explaining that she wouldn't be home until well after midnight. "Don't wait up for me," she'd said, her voice already distant, already consumed by the world of beeping machines and sterile corridors. After he hung up, a profound silence settled over the house, a silence that felt heavier and more significant than usual. It was the kind of quiet that amplifies the presence of the only other person in it. Chloe was in her room, the soft thrum of some indie rock band vibrating faintly through the floorboards. For a while, Ethan tried to work, but the numbers on his spreadsheet seemed to mock his attempts at focus. The house felt too big, too empty. Eventually, Chloe emerged, a book in her hand. "Looks like it's just us tonight," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes held a question. "Looks that way," Ethan agreed. They stood in the hallway for a moment, caught in a limbo of politeness. The evening stretched before them, a blank canvas. "Want to watch a movie or something?" she suggested, breaking the stillness. "I can't stand this quiet." Ethan's agreement came a little too quickly. "Yeah, definitely. Good idea." It felt like a perfectly innocent way to pass the time, a simple remedy for a lonely night. But as they settled onto the large sectional sofa in the living room, a tangible sense of occasion began to build in the air, a low hum of anticipation that had nothing to do with the film they were about to watch. They dimmed the lights, and the room was enveloped in an intimate darkness, illuminated only by the cool, flickering blue light of the television screen. A large bowl of popcorn sat between them on the center cushion, a kind of neutral territory, a buffer. Chloe had changed out of her jeans and into something more comfortable. A pair of soft, heather gray cotton shorts that ended high on her thigh, and a simple white tank top. As she curled her legs up underneath her, Ethan's eyes snagged on the long, smooth line of her leg, pale and luminous in the screen's glow. He quickly forced his gaze back to the movie, but his senses were on high alert, attuned entirely to her. He was aware of the subtle weight of her on the cushions, the faint, clean scent of her skin, the soft sound of her breathing. The tank top she wore was thin, and as she shifted, he could see the gentle, braless curve of her breast in silhouette. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot through him. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. He was a man sitting in the dark with his wife's sister, and the only thing he could think about was the delicate, shadowed hollow at the base of her throat. The movie was a thriller, full of suspenseful music and sudden scares. During one particularly tense scene, Chloe let out a small gasp and instinctively shifted closer, her shoulder brushing against his arm. The contact was brief, accidental, but it burned through the fabric of his shirt. He didn't pull away. He sat perfectly still, his heart hammering against his ribs, every nerve ending in his body screamingly aware of that single point of contact. He could feel the warmth of her, a living, breathing heat that seemed to seep directly into his own skin. He tried to focus on the film, on the dialogue, on the plot, but it was all just a meaningless buzz. The real thriller was happening right here, on this sofa, in the charged space between them. Then came the moment. The film reached its emotional climax, a quiet, intense scene between the two leads, their faces close, their dialogue whispered and heavy with meaning. Out of the corner of his eye, Ethan saw Chloe turn her head to look at him, perhaps to gauge his reaction. He turned to meet her gaze, and the world stopped. The movie, the popcorn, the quiet house, it all dissolved into nothing. There was only the look in her eyes. In the flickering blue light, her pupils were wide and dark, and in them he saw it. He saw the same dangerous curiosity, the same unspoken question, the same terrifying desire that was clawing its way up his own throat. It wasn't just him. This wasn't just in his head. This was real, a silent, mutual confession happening in the space of a few heartbeats. He saw her lips part slightly, her breath becoming a shallow whisper. An impulse, primal and overwhelming, seized him. It was a physical force, an undertow pulling him forward. He had to touch her. He had to know if her skin was as soft as it looked, if her lips were as warm as he imagined. His hand, which had been resting on the cushion beside him, began to lift. The movement was infinitesimal, agonizingly slow. He watched his own fingers, as if they belonged to a stranger, rising from the darkness. He was going to cup her face, to thread his fingers into her hair, to finally close the unbearable distance between them. He saw her eyes flicker down to his approaching hand, and then back to his face. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She was waiting. The tips of his fingers were a mere inch from her cheek when a switch flipped in his brain. A single, violent image of Olivia's smiling face, bright and trusting, flashed behind his eyes. The word wrong echoed in his skull, a deafening alarm. With a surge of will that felt like tearing muscle from bone, he stopped. He clenched his hand into a tight, white-knuckled fist and drew it back, planting it firmly on his own knee. The spell was broken. The air, which had been vibrating with energy, went suddenly, brutally still. Chloe blinked and turned back to the screen, her body rigid. Ethan stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his breath caught in his chest. They sat like that, two statues in the dark, for the rest of the movie, the unspoken event pulsating between them, more real and more present than anything happening on the screen. When the credits finally rolled, plunging the room into an even deeper silence, Chloe unfolded herself from the sofa in one swift, awkward motion. "Well," she said, her voice thin and reedy, "I'm exhausted." She didn't look at him. "Think I'll head to bed." She was already walking away. "Good night, Ethan." He heard her footsteps retreat down the hall. "Good night, Chloe," he whispered to the empty room. He remained on the sofa for a long time, the darkness, a cold comfort. He hadn't crossed the line, but he had walked right up to the edge, felt the heat rising from the canyon, and known, with a soul-deep, sickening certainty, that he was already lost. The temptation had been offered, and even in his refusal, he had accepted it. The 3 days that followed the movie night were a masterclass in avoidance. The air in the house grew thick with unspoken words, so dense that Ethan felt he had to push his way through it. He and Chloe moved like ghosts in their own home, navigating around each other with a carefully orchestrated politeness that was far more intimate than any casual conversation had ever been. They were hyper-aware of each other's location at all times. If he was in the kitchen, she would stay in her room. If she was on the sofa, he would retreat to his office. Their brief exchanges were purely functional. "Is the coffee made?" Olivia called. "She's running late." Each sterile sentence was a brick being placed on a wall between them, a wall they were both desperately, frantically building. Olivia, cocooned in her world of exhaustion and hospital shifts, seemed to notice nothing, attributing the quiet house to their collective fatigue. Her obliviousness was a strange kind of torture, making the secret world Ethan and Chloe now shared feel even more vivid, more real. The wall came down late on a Tuesday night. It was well past 1 a.m, and the house was submerged in a deep, suburban silence. Ethan couldn't sleep. The scene from the movie night played on a loop in his mind. The look in her eyes, the feeling of his own hand, heavy with intent, hovering in the space between them. He went downstairs for a glass of water, the cool tiles on the kitchen floor, a small shock to his bare feet. As he passed the living room, he saw a sliver of light from the street lamp outside, cutting across the floor, and in it, a shape. It was Chloe, curled up in the large armchair, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face buried in her arms. A soft, shuddering sound reached him, the unmistakable rhythm of someone trying, and failing, to cry silently. He froze in the doorway, his first instinct to retreat, to pretend he hadn't seen her, to preserve the fragile, awkward peace they had built. But her vulnerability was a force stronger than his discomfort. She looked so small, so utterly defeated, a world away from the vibrant, confident woman who had first arrived. He took a hesitant step into the room. "Chloe?" he whispered, his voice sounding rough in the quiet. Her head shot up, her face streaked with tears, her eyes wide and startled in the dim light. She quickly wiped at her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Ethan, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't," he said, moving closer. He leaned against the arm of the sofa, creating a safe distance. "What's wrong?" For a moment, she seemed like she might deflect, might retreat back into herself. But then, something seemed to break. A fresh wave of tears welled in her eyes, and the story tumbled out of her in a hushed, broken torrent. It was a rejection letter. A prestigious artist residency she had pinned all her hopes on had turned her down. The letter wasn't just a no, it was clinical and dismissive, picking apart the portfolio she had poured her soul into. "They said my work lacks a mature perspective," she choked out, the words tasting like poison in her mouth, "that it's derivative. Everything I've been working toward, everything I thought I was, it's just a cheap copy of someone else's art." She wasn't just talking about her painting, she was talking about herself. It was a crisis of identity, a fear that she was a fraud, that she had no real talent, that she had made a terrible mistake moving to a city that was so ready to chew her up and spit her out. As he listened, Ethan felt the last of the tension between them dissolve, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated empathy. He saw past the woman on the couch, past the object of his illicit desire, and saw the scared, insecure young person beneath it all. He found himself wanting more than anything to ease her pain. "That's bullshit," he said, his voice firm. "I've seen your work. It's incredible. It's full of life." He told her about his own early years, about a professor who told him his designs were uninspired, about the crushing weight of trying to prove himself in a competitive field. He shared a piece of his own failure, a small, guarded part of his past that he never spoke of, not even to Olivia. And in sharing it, he offered Chloe a lifeline. He was no longer just her sister's husband. He was an ally, someone who understood the unique sting of creative rejection. She was crying freely now, not fighting it anymore. The confession had drained her. He moved from the sofa and knelt in front of her chair. "Hey," he said softly, "you're gonna be okay." And then, acting on an impulse that felt both entirely natural and incredibly dangerous, he reached out and put his arms around her. He pulled her forward, her head coming to rest on his shoulder. It started as a hug of pure comfort. He could feel the sharp, bony angles of her shoulders, the fine silk of her hair against his cheek. He held her as she cried, her tears soaking the collar of his t-shirt, her small, trembling frame feeling fragile in his arms. He was just comforting her. That's what he told himself. But the hug stretched on, long past the point of simple solace. Her sobs subsided into quiet, hitched breaths, but neither of them made a move to pull away. The nature of the embrace began to change. The air grew thick and heavy again. His role as comforter was being overtaken by his identity as a man. His heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against her ear. Slowly, deliberately, his hand began to move. It was a conscious decision. His fingers traced a lazy, soothing circle on her back, feeling the warmth of her skin through the thin cotton of her shirt. He was testing the water, pushing the boundary. He felt her breath catch for a second, a tiny, almost imperceptible reaction. But she didn't pull away. Emboldened, his hand slid from her shoulder blade down the elegant, subtle curve of her spine. He felt every vertebra, every contour. His hand came to rest in the small of her back, his fingers spreading out over the warm, soft flesh just above the waistband of her shorts. He applied a gentle pressure, pulling her impossibly closer, fitting her body against his. The gesture was no longer comforting. It was possessive. It was a claim. This was the moment of truth, the point of no return. And her response was his answer. She didn't stiffen. She didn't resist. Instead, a soft, sighing sound escaped her lips, and she seemed to melt into him, her body going pliant in his arms. She shifted her head, nuzzling her face into the crook of his neck. Her own hand, which had been resting limply between them, came up and loosely gripped the fabric of his shirt. It was a surrender. A quiet, nonverbal acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them on the couch a few nights ago. She wasn't just accepting his comfort, she was accepting his desire. They stayed like that, locked in the silent, charged embrace for what felt like an eternity. When they finally, reluctantly, drew apart, the air was electric. They looked at each other, and there were no more secrets, no more pretense. Guilt, desire, fear, and a terrifying sense of inevitability were all reflected in their gaze. "I'd go to bed," she whispered, her voice husky. She stood up and practically fled from the room, leaving Ethan kneeling alone on the floor in the semi-darkness. He stayed there for a long time, the phantom feeling of her body still pressed against his. A line had been crossed. It wasn't a physical act of passion, but it was an emotional one. It was a confession made not with words, but with a lingering touch in the dead of night. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had just given them both permission to fall. The 2 days following their late-night embrace were a silent, agonizing dance. The unspoken had been acknowledged, the forbidden desire brought out into the open air between them, and now it was a living entity in the house. It sat with them at the breakfast table, it followed them down the hallway, it filled the spaces in their stilted conversations. They were achingly aware of each other, of the magnetic pull that seemed to hum in the very walls of the home. Ethan found himself tracing the memory of her body against his, the feeling of her soft hair on his cheek. He would see her across the room and his stomach would clench with a feeling so potent it stole his breath. It was no longer a question of if, but a terrifying, exhilarating question of when. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for them. And then, the storm came. It had been threatening all afternoon, the sky a bruised greenish gray, the air thick and heavy, with a humidity you could wear like a blanket. Olivia, with a sigh of resignation, had left for a mandatory hospital fundraiser, a fact that registered in Ethan's mind with a significance that made him feel sick with guilt and anticipation. He and Chloe were left alone as the first rumbles of distant thunder echoed like a warning. They made a pretense of normalcy, Chloe sketching at the dining room table while Ethan stared blankly at his laptop screen. But the approaching storm was a perfect mirror for their internal state, a volatile, charged atmosphere on the verge of breaking. The first drops of rain hit the windows like scattered pebbles, and then the sky opened up. The wind howled, and the rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet. And then, with a flicker and a final, apologetic hum from the refrigerator, the house went dark. The sudden plunge into absolute blackness was disorienting, shocking. All the familiar shapes of their home vanished, leaving only the sound of the tempest raging outside. In the suffocating darkness, Ethan's senses screamed to life. "Chloe," he called out, his voice sounding thin against the roar of the wind. "Are you okay?" A beat of silence, and then her voice, closer than he expected. "I'm here. I'm fine." He fumbled for his phone, the sudden beam of its flashlight cutting a nervous path through the gloom. He found her standing by the large living room window, a pale silhouette against the violent, strobing flashes of lightning. He walked toward her, his footsteps unnaturally loud on the hardwood floor. "The circuit breaker must have tripped," he said, the words feeling stupid and mundane in the face of the electric tension between them. "I'll go check." But he made no move to leave. He stood beside her, and they watched the storm-lashed world outside together. In the dark, the ordinary rules of space and propriety seemed to have been suspended. He could smell the faint, clean scent of her skin and the charcoal from her sketchbook. Another flash of lightning lit the room in a stark, momentary photograph, and he saw her face, her expression a mixture of awe and fear, her lips slightly parted. The space between them, once measured in feet, now felt like a millimeter of charged air. His hand found hers in the darkness. It wasn't an accident, it was a question. She answered by twining her fingers with his, her grip tight, desperate. It was an anchor in the storm, for both of them. He turned to face her fully, his other hand coming up to cup her cheek. Her skin was soft, electric. A deafening crack of thunder shook the house, and in the ensuing silence, he leaned down and kissed her. It was nothing like their first frantic, fumbling kiss in the kitchen. This was slow, deep, and deliberate. It was a kiss of utter surrender, a final, silent confession of all the desire they had been trying to suppress. It tasted of the rain and the ozone-laced air, and an agonizing, long-overdue inevitability. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. There was no turning back. Without a word, he kept hold of her hand and led her through the darkness, down the hall to her room. Inside, the strobing lightning was their only guide. In one brilliant, momentary flash, he saw her, truly saw her. She stood before him, her eyes dark pools of apprehension and want. He reached for the tie on the silk robe she was wearing, his fingers fumbling slightly. The fabric was cool and smooth as it slid from her shoulders, pooling at her feet on the floor. And then the room was lit again, a startling, vivid flash, and his breath caught in his throat. Underneath, she was wearing a bra and panties of deep, crimson lace. It was a slash of color in the darkness, a secret she had been holding. It was a deliberate choice, an admission that she had been waiting for this moment just as desperately as he had. He could see the rapid pulse in her throat, the way her full, firm breast strained against the delicate fabric. She was beautiful and terrifying, and she was his for the taking. They came together and fell onto the bed, a tangle of limbs and frantic, searching hands. The storm outside was a symphony to their own chaotic passion. "Ethan," she breathed against his lips, a last fleeting protest. "This island, we can't." He silenced her with another kiss, a kiss that devoured her words, her doubts. He felt the exact moment her resistance crumbled, the tension in her body dissolving into pure, liquid need. Her protest softened, her no melting into a ragged, helpless moan of his name, Ethan. It was a prayer and a curse all at once. The world shrank to the confines of that bed, to the sound of the rain lashing against the window, to the feel of her skin, slick and hot beneath his. It was a frantic, clumsy discovery, a desperate act of taking and being taken. Every touch was a transgression, every kiss a betrayal, but the pleasure was so profound, so all-consuming, that it burned all thoughts of guilt to ash. There was only the slick slide of skin on skin, the muffled gasps they tried to bury in the pillows, the raw, undeniable truth of their bodies finally saying what their words could not. Afterward, they lay tangled in the damp sheets, their breathing slowly returning to normal. Outside, the storm's fury had passed, leaving behind a steady, calming rain. The silence in the room was a heavy blanket, thick with the enormity of what they had done. He could feel the faint, steady beat of her heart against his chest. He had crossed the line. They had set fire to the world, and now all they could do was lie in the darkness and wait for the dawn to see what, if anything, was left of it. The dawn that followed the storm was quiet and cruel. Ethan woke with a start in his own bed, the pale, gray light of morning filtering through the blinds, slicing the room into bars of shadow and truth. For a single, blissful second, His mind was a blank slate. Then, like a physical blow, the memory of the night before crashed down on him. The darkness, the rain, the scent of her skin, the shocking, illicit warmth of her body against his. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the images were seared onto the backs of his eyelids. A groan of self-loathing escaped his lips, swallowed by the pillow. His own bed felt alien, the sheets that held the familiar scent of his wife and his marriage now feeling like a bed of nails. Guilt was a physical entity, a sour, metallic taste in his mouth and a heavy, leaden weight in his gut. He forced himself out of bed, moving like an old man. The familiar routine of dressing was a bizarre pantomime. He picked out a shirt, buttoned it, and felt like an imposter in his own skin. The sunlight streaming through the window felt accusatory, its unforgiving clarity exposing everything the permissive darkness had concealed. Downstairs, the house was painfully normal. The air smelled of damp earth from the storm, and a few stray leaves had blown onto the front porch. In the kitchen, he found Chloe. She was already dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a severe ponytail. She was standing at the counter, methodically pouring coffee into a mug, her movements precise and contained. The passionate, vulnerable creature from the storm-tossed bed was gone, replaced by this cool, distant stranger. "Morning," she said, without turning to look at him. Her voice was brittle, a thin sheet of ice that he knew would crack under the slightest pressure. "Morning," he replied, his own voice a hoarse whisper. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the ghosts of her moans and his frantic heartbeats. What they had done was a wild, untamed thing, and here in the light of day, she was trying to cage it to pretend it didn't exist. Her denial was somehow worse than any accusation. It made their shared sin feel cheap, sordid, and meaningless. He moved through the house like a trespasser. Every object seemed to mock him. The armchair in the living room where he had held her while she cried. The sofa where their eyes had first met with shared forbidden knowledge. His entire home had been repurposed. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a crime scene, and her fingerprints were everywhere. The sound of the garage door opening sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through him. His body went rigid. Across the room, Chloe's shoulders tensed, the only outward sign that she was anything but calm. Olivia was home. She walked in through the kitchen door, looking exhausted but beautiful, her cheeks flushed from the cool morning air. She was carrying a pink bakery box. "The caterers had so many leftover croissants," she announced with a weary smile. "I figured we deserved a treat." She came over to Ethan and gave him a quick, casual kiss on the cheek. The touch of her lips was like a brand, a mark of his hypocrisy. "Morning, sleepyheads," she said, her cheerful voice, a physical assault on his raw nerves. "Looks like you two survived the storm." The breakfast that followed was the most exquisite form of torture Ethan could have possibly imagined. Olivia, in her blissful ignorance, insisted on making a real meal to go with the pastries. Soon the kitchen was filled with the comforting, domestic sounds of sizzling bacon and the gentle clink of plates, sounds of home, sounds of the life he was actively destroying. He sat at the table, a prisoner at his own execution. He watched his wife move around the kitchen, her familiar, efficient grace, a painful reminder of everything he was betraying. He risked a glance at Chloe. She was staring intently into the black depths of her coffee cup, as if it held all the secrets of the universe. She answered Olivia's questions about the power outage with short, clipped sentences, volunteering nothing. Olivia, for her part, chattered on about the fundraiser, about hospital gossip, about a funny thing one of her patients had said. She was the anchor of normalcy in a sea of silent, screaming tension. "Ethan, honey, you're awfully quiet," Olivia said, turning to him with a look of loving concern. "Did you sleep okay?" He couldn't meet her eyes. He stared at a spot on the tablecloth, a tiny, insignificant stain that he focused on with the intensity of a surgeon. "Fine," he mumbled, "just tired." The lie was effortless, and it disgusted him. He felt like a hollow man, an actor performing the role of husband from a script he had forgotten. He could feel Olivia's gaze on him, questioning, but she eventually shrugged it off, attributing his mood to the storm or work stress. Her trust, her inability to even conceive of his betrayal, was the cruelest cut of all. He was a monster hiding in plain sight, and she was smiling at him, offering him a croissant. Each bite he forced down felt like swallowing broken glass. His mind was a maelstrom of self-hatred, contrasting the two women. Olivia, so good, so constant, the bedrock of his life. And Chloe, the silent co-conspirator sitting 3 feet away, a living, breathing symbol of his weakness. But the blame, the searing, white-hot blame, was reserved for himself. He was the one who held the matches. He was the one who had set their world on fire. The moment the meal was over, he fled. "I've got to get to the office," he announced, standing so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Need to get a head start on the week." It was a flimsy excuse on a Saturday morning, but it was all he had. He grabbed his keys, gave Olivia a fleeting, clumsy kiss on the forehead, and practically ran out of the house. He didn't look at Chloe. He couldn't. He got in his car and drove, with no destination in mind. In the rearview mirror, he saw his house, a perfect picture of suburban stability, recede into the distance. The storm was over. The passion had cooled. And in the clean, quiet morning after, there was nothing left but the cold, heavy, suffocating weight of what he had done. The guilt, for a time, was a physical presence, a third person in Ethan's marriage. It sat between him and Olivia at the dinner table. It lay in the empty space in their bed when she was at the hospital. It was a cold, constant companion. But guilt, he was discovering, is a fire that needs fuel. And without the immediate consequence of discovery, its flames began to burn lower. In its place, something else began to grow, something insidious and far more powerful: memory. The guilt was a dull, persistent ache, but the memory of Chloe was a sharp, searing pleasure. At his desk, staring at the clean, logical lines of a blueprint, his mind would betray him, conjuring the feeling of her soft skin under his hands, the sound of her breathy moans muffled by the storm. He would close his eyes and smell the jasmine in her hair, taste the rain on her lips. The shame was real, but the craving, the deep, cellular craving to have her again, was becoming stronger. It was a desperate, gnawing hunger that the memory of one night could no longer satisfy. The fragile wall of avoidance between him and Chloe began to crumble, not with a crash, but through a series of small, seismic tremors. The awkwardness was replaced by a new, charged language of stolen glances and fleeting touches. A brush of her hand against his as they both reached for the coffee pot was no longer an accident to be recoiled from, but a moment of electric contact to be savored. One afternoon, he found her in the laundry room, folding her clothes. The air was warm and smelled of detergent. As she reached up to place a stack of t-shirts on a high shelf, her shirt rode up, exposing the delicate, pale skin of her lower back. She caught him looking, and for a split second, her movements stilled. She didn't pull her shirt down. Instead, a slow, knowing smile touched her lips before she turned away. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared secret, a permission slip written in a language only they understood. The guilt hadn't vanished, but it had been relegated, forced to make room for a thrilling, terrifying conspiracy. The opportunity came on a Wednesday. Olivia was covering a colleague's night shift, a last-minute change to the schedule. The news landed in the quiet house like a struck match. As evening bled into night, the atmosphere grew thick with anticipation. The pretense was gone. They both knew what this night meant, what this emptiness in the house was offering them. Around 10, he found her in her room, curled up on her bed, reading, bathed in the soft glow of her bedside lamp. She was wearing a simple, oversized gray t-shirt that fell to her mid-thigh. He stood in the doorway, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The silence stretched, filled with all the things they had done, and all the things they were about to do. He was the one to finally break it. "I can't stop thinking about it, Chloe," he said, his voice a low, rough confession. She looked up from her book, her blue eyes dark and serious in the lamplight. She didn't feign confusion. She didn't pretend not to know what he meant. "Neither can I, Ethan," she whispered, and the words were all the invitation he needed. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed. This time, there was no storm, no darkness, no excuse of adrenaline or fear. There was only choice. There was only want. He reached out and gently took the book from her hands, setting it aside. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, and she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut. When he kissed her, it was with a desperate, pent-up hunger that the first encounter had only hinted at. He pulled the gray t-shirt over her head, and his breath hitched. The crimson lace from the night of the storm had been a shocking surprise. Tonight was a deliberate statement. She was wearing a matching set of the most delicate black lace, a stark, erotic contrast against the pale canvas of her skin. It was barely there, hiding nothing, designed only for this, for him. "You knew," he murmured against her throat. "I hoped," she breathed back. This time, he took his time. The frantic, fumbling energy of their first encounter was replaced by a slow, deliberate exploration. He was a cartographer, charting a new and beautiful world. He kissed the hollow of her throat, the curve of her collarbone, the soft swell of her breasts above the lace. He learned the texture of her skin, the pattern of her freckles, the way she shivered when he touched the sensitive skin of her inner arm. He turned her over, his hands sliding down her back, learning the elegant curve of her spine. His palms came to rest on the swell of her buttocks, and he marveled at their perfect heart-like shape, at the firm, smooth skin beneath the sheer lace. He traced their outline, his touch both reverent and possessive. When she let out a soft, aching moan and arched into his hand, a savage wave of triumph surged through him. He was discovering her, and in doing so, he felt as though he was truly being seen for the first time in years. When he finally entered her, it was with a slow, profound certainty that felt like coming home. She wrapped her legs around him, her hands gripping his back, her nails scraping lightly against his skin. Their bodies moved in a rhythm that was no longer exploratory, but confident, knowing. The sounds were different this time, too. There were no muffled protests, no gasps of surprise. There were only the open, honest sounds of pure pleasure. Her head was thrown back against the pillows, her lips parted as she whispered his name, over and over. "Ethan, oh God, right there, please." She panted, her words not a surrender, but a demand, a guide, an invitation to a shared ecstasy. He felt a powerful, possessive pride in being the cause of her pleasure, in knowing how to touch her, how to make her lose herself. It was a heady, intoxicating power, an addiction taking root in his very soul. They lay in the aftermath, their bodies slick with sweat, their limbs tangled. The silence that fell was not the heavy, guilt-ridden quiet of the first time. It was a comfortable, sated silence. The affair was no longer a secret they were keeping from each other, but a world they were building together. He left her room hours later, returning to the cold, empty space of his marital bed just before dawn. He could still smell her on his skin, feel her on his lips. The guilt was still there, a distant, nagging voice in the back of his mind, but it was drowned out by the roaring in his blood. This was no longer a one-time transgression, a momentary lapse in judgment. It was a decision he had made again, consciously and deliberately. It was an escalation, and as he lay in the dark, a terrifying, thrilling thought surfaced. He couldn't wait to do it again. Familiarity, Ethan discovered, is the enemy of caution. In the weeks that followed their second encounter, a dangerous routine began to solidify. Their affair was no longer a series of isolated, explosive events, but a constant, simmering undercurrent in the life of the house. It lived in the lingering touches in the kitchen as they passed each other, in the way his hand would find her knee under the dinner table when Olivia was distracted, in the secret, knowing smiles they exchanged over his wife's head. They had become experts in a silent, illicit language. Their phones held threads of secret conversations, filled with coded desires and plans for their next stolen moment. With each successful deception, a layer of fear was stripped away, replaced by a heady, intoxicating sense of invincibility. They were existing in a bubble of their own creation, a secret world where the only rules were their own. The danger, the risk of it all, had transformed from a deterrent into an aphrodisiac. They were careless because they believed they couldn't be caught. The close call came, as it always does, on a day that felt impossibly safe. It was a bright, lazy Saturday afternoon. Olivia, with a kiss to Ethan's cheek, had headed out for what she promised would be an all-day affair, a long overdue lunch with her friends from the hospital, followed by an indulgent, aimless shopping trip. "Don't expect me back before sunset," she'd said, grabbing her favorite purse. My credit card is going to need a vacation of its own after this. The sound of her car pulling out of the driveway was the starting pistol they had been waiting for. The empty house stretched before them, a private kingdom for the afternoon. The risk of venturing beyond the relative safety of Chloe's bedroom was part of the thrill. Today, they claimed the living room, the very heart of the home Ethan and Olivia had built together. It was a profound act of territorial defiance. They were on the large sectional sofa, the Saturday sunlight streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. They were lost in their own world, a tangle of limbs and soft, hungry kisses. Chloe's blouse was unbuttoned, lying open, and Ethan's t-shirt was on the floor somewhere by the coffee table. They were laughing, their whispers punctuated by the soft sounds of skin on skin. In that moment, Olivia felt like a character from a different story, a person who existed in another dimension. This room, this house, this life belonged only to them. He was tracing the delicate lace edge of her bra when a sound from the outside world pierced their perfect, illicit bubble, the distinct, familiar crunch of tires on the gravel of their driveway. For a frozen second, neither of them moved, their brains refusing to process the information. It couldn't be. It was too early. Then came the cheerful, electronic chirp of Olivia's car being unlocked. The sound was a gunshot. Passion evaporated in an instant, replaced by a surge of pure, ice-cold terror. They scrambled apart, their eyes wide with a shared animal panic. "Oh my God," Chloe breathed, her face ashen. The next 10 seconds were a frantic, silent ballet of desperation. He grabbed his t-shirt from the floor, pulling it on, his fumbling fingers struggling with the familiar fabric. Chloe was frantically buttoning her blouse, her hands shaking so badly she could barely manage the simple task. "Your hair," he hissed, and she quickly, clumsily, tried to smooth the wild mess of it. He turned to the sofa, punching the cushions, trying to erase the deep indentations their bodies had left, to make it look untouched, casual. The sound of a key sliding into the front door lock was the loudest sound he had ever heard. He did one last, sweeping glance around the room, his eyes snagged on something small and metallic, glinting in the sunlight on the dark floorboards near the leg of the sofa. One of Chloe's silver earrings, a small, delicate hoop. There was no time. The doorknob was turning. He shot Chloe a look of pure horror. Her eyes followed his, widened, and she stifled a tiny gasp. The door swung open and Olivia breezed in, smiling, holding up a single shopping bag. "I am the most ridiculous human on the planet," she announced, laughing at herself. "We sat down for lunch, and I realized I left my wallet on the nightstand. I'm so sorry to interrupt your lazy day." She was a vision of radiant, heartbreaking normalcy. Ethan's heart was hammering against his ribs so violently he was sure the whole room could feel the vibration. He forced a smile that felt like a painful grimace. No problem. We were just watching a movie." It was the stupidest, most obvious lie. The television screen behind them was black and silent. Chloe, to her credit, recovered faster. "That's the worst feeling," she said, her voice only trembling slightly. "Did you want me to grab it for you?" "No, I'll get it," Olivia said, already heading toward the hallway that led to the master bedroom. But then she paused, turning back. "You know, I am dying of thirst. I'm going to grab a bottle of water first." She started walking toward the kitchen, a path that would take her right past the sofa. Right past the damning, glinting piece of silver on the floor, Ethan's mind raced, a chaotic flood of panicked scenarios. He had to stop her. As she drew level with the coffee table, he lurched forward, pretending to stumble. "Whoa," he yelped, knocking a heavy art book off the table. It landed on the floor with a loud, dramatic thud, conveniently close to the earring. "Clumsy," he muttered, bending down to retrieve it. His hands were sweating, his movements stiff. As he reached for the book, he shielded the earring with his body and, in one swift, desperate motion, scooped it into his palm, closing his hand around the sharp, incriminating metal. "You okay, babe?" Olivia asked, pausing with a concerned look. "Yeah, fine," he said, his voice strained as he stood up, the book in one hand, the earring digging into his palm. "Just a little clumsy today." She shrugged, continued into the kitchen, and the moment of immediate peril was over. She returned a minute later, wallet in hand, gave him another quick kiss, and with a cheerful, "Okay, take two," she was gone. The front door clicked shut, and the sound of her car starting up and pulling away filled the sudden vast silence. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor Chloe moved. They stood frozen, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving them feeling cold, shaky, and nauseous. He finally unclenched his fist and stared at the tiny silver hoop in his palm. It looked so innocent, so small, yet it was the physical manifestation of their recklessness. It was the key to their destruction, a small piece of metal that could have brought his entire world crashing down. The thrill was gone. The intoxicating feeling of invincibility had been utterly shattered. In its place was a raw, gnawing fear. He looked at Chloe, her face pale, her bravado gone, and he didn't just see the woman he desired. He saw the accomplice to his crime. He saw the fuse to the bomb he had planted in the center of his own life. The affair was no longer a secret escape. It was a loaded gun they had been playfully tossing back and forth, and it had just gone off, missing them by a millimeter. The incident with the earring changed the very texture of the affair. The wild, reckless heat that had fueled them was instantly chilled by a harsh dose of reality. The invincibility they had felt was replaced by a constant, low-grade paranoia. Every unexpected crunch of tires in the driveway, every time Olivia's phone rang with an unknown number, sent a spike of cold dread through Ethan's veins. Their physical encounters became less frequent, planned with the meticulous, nerve-shredding precision of a heist. They were no longer two lovers caught in a passionate storm. They were two criminals, terrified of leaving behind a single piece of evidence. But a strange and toxic side effect emerged from this new state of fear. The shared secret, now laced with the memory of their near disaster, became a bond far stronger than pleasure ever could have been. They were partners in a high-stakes crime, and this shared danger fostered a dark, ferocious intimacy. This new, profound connection with Chloe had to be paid for, and the price was Ethan's emotional connection to his wife. A chasm, imperceptible to Olivia, began to open between them. He would sit across from her at the dinner table and feel as though he were looking at her through a thick wall of glass. She would talk about her day, a difficult patient, a funny story from the nurse's station, and he would nod and make the appropriate sounds, but his mind was a million miles away. He was replaying a whispered conversation he'd had with Chloe in the hallway, or dissecting the meaning of a single charged glance she'd given him from across the room. Olivia's world, once the center of his own, now seemed mundane, its colors faded. Her very presence, once a comfort, began to feel like an intrusion into the secret, vibrant world he now inhabited with her sister. The guilt that had once tormented him began a slow, monstrous transformation into resentment. He started to see Olivia not as the woman he had wronged, but as the obstacle to the woman he wanted. Her goodness, her trust, her complete lack of suspicion no longer inspired shame. It inspired a twisted kind of anger. It made their deception too easy, and it made her seem naive, a child he had to lie to. The resentment crystallized one evening when she planned a surprise date night for them. She had booked a table at the restaurant where he had proposed, her eyes shining with the hope of recapturing something they had lost, something she couldn't name but could clearly feel slipping away. For Ethan, the gesture felt less like an act of love and more like a summons. It was an entire evening he would have to spend performing the role of a loving husband, an evening he was being forced to steal from Chloe. Throughout the dinner, he was a ghost. He found himself unfairly cataloging Olivia's flaws. The way she told a story he'd heard a dozen times, the predictability of her opinions, the very stability that he had once cherished, it all felt like a cage. He would catch himself thinking, Chloe would find that funny, or Chloe would have a more interesting take on this. He was comparing his wife to her sister, and in the warped reality of his infatuated mind, Olivia was losing. He looked at the beautiful, earnest woman across the table, the woman who had built a life with him, and felt a chilling detachment. He felt trapped, and he resented her for being the one who held the key. At home, the emotional web grew more tangled. Chloe was changing too. The thrill of the secret was no longer enough for her. She began to show signs of wanting more than just stolen moments in the dark. The affair, for her, was evolving from a physical act into an emotional reality, and she wanted that reality to have a future. One night, as they stood together in the darkness of the kitchen, their bodies close but not touching, she looked at him with a new, searching intensity. "Do you ever wish," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "that things were just different, simpler?" It was a carefully veiled question, but its meaning was perfectly clear. She wasn't asking for a different world, she was asking for a world without Olivia in it. He saw flashes of possessiveness in her too. If he and Olivia shared a private joke or a moment of genuine marital affection, he would catch a flicker of something in Chloe's eyes, a brief, cold shadow of hurt and jealousy that she would quickly mask. The unspoken, no-strings-attached nature of their affair was dissolving. She was falling for him, or perhaps falling in love with the idea of the life he represented, and her burgeoning expectations were a new, terrifying complication. The new dynamic of their lives was perfectly encapsulated one quiet Sunday evening. The three of them were in the living room, a perfect tableau of domestic peace. Olivia was curled in the big armchair, lost in a novel. On the sofa, Ethan and Chloe were ostensibly watching a movie, a large, soft blanket draped over their laps. The scene on the television was meaningless, a backdrop of noise and light to the real drama happening beneath the wool. Under the cover of the blanket, his hand was intertwined with hers. He could feel the delicate bones of her fingers, the warmth of her palm. He gently squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back, a secret, silent conversation. He looked at her, and her eyes met his over the fabricated distance between them. The look was filled with their shared secrets, their shared sin, their shared future, whatever that might be. At that exact moment, Olivia looked up from her book, a warm, placid smile on her face as she took in the scene. "I'm so glad you two get along so well," she said, her voice filled with genuine, innocent happiness. "It's so nice having you here, Chloe. The house feels so much more alive." The words, so kind and guileless, landed with the force of a physical blow. Ethan felt a sharp, disorienting pang. It wasn't guilt, not anymore. It was a strange, hollow pity for his wife's profound blindness. He looked from his wife, the anchor of his life, to the woman whose hand he was holding, the source of his exhilarating ruin. The web was complete. He was bound to both of them, trapped in a suffocating, intricate lattice of love, lies, and desire. And he knew, with a terrifying clarity, that a web so tightly woven could only end in one way, by tearing apart. The foundation of their secret world, which had seemed so thrillingly robust in the dark, was rotting from within. The strain of the constant deception, the near miss with the earring, and the growing complexities of his emotional entanglement with Chloe began to take their toll on Ethan. The man who had once been meticulous, calm, and structured was becoming a frayed, volatile stranger in his own home. He was jumpy, his head snapping up with defensive alertness every time his phone buzzed. He started forgetting the small, intricate lies he'd woven, occasionally contradicting himself about where he'd been or what he'd been doing, leaving Olivia with a puzzled, questioning look on her face. His temper grew short, the constant pressure finding release in sudden, disproportionate bursts of irritation. A misplaced set of keys, or a simple question about their weekend plans, could trigger a sharp, defensive response that was entirely out of character, leaving a bewildered, wounded silence in its wake. Olivia was a nurse. Her entire professional life was built on observation, on noticing the subtle symptoms that pointed to a deeper, hidden illness. And her husband was gravely ill. She had felt the emotional distance for months, attributing it to stress, to fatigue, to a dozen other plausible, forgivable causes. But now, she was seeing more than just distance. She was seeing symptoms. She saw the way Ethan and her sister, Chloe, seemed to have developed their own private, silent language. A flicker of an expression, a brief moment of eye contact across the dinner table held a weight, a meaning, that she could feel but not decipher. She noticed how they were rarely in the same room alone together anymore, as if by some unspoken agreement, but how their paths would coincidentally cross the moment Olivia left a room. She saw how Ethan's eyes would follow Chloe as she walked through the house, an intensity in his gaze that was no longer brotherly. Her heart, which had been making excuses for him, slowly began to harden with a cold, terrifying suspicion. She started to watch them, her gaze no longer just that of a loving wife and sister, but of a quiet, vigilant detective in her own home. She replayed conversations in her mind, re-examined odd moments, and the pieces began to fit together into a picture she could not bear to look at. The gut feeling, the vague sense of unease, was solidifying into a specific, nameable dread. She still had no proof, nothing tangible she could hold on to. It was just a collection of shadows, a pattern of wrongness. But she knew, with the certainty of a clinician diagnosing a fatal disease, that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong in her house. The proof, when it came, was banal in its delivery and biblical in its devastation. It happened on a Thursday evening. Ethan had gone upstairs to take a shower before dinner, leaving his phone charging on the kitchen counter. Olivia was chopping vegetables, the rhythmic thud of the knife a familiar, comforting sound. The house was quiet, peaceful. Then, a soft chime. Ethan's phone screen lit up, illuminating the darkening kitchen. Olivia glanced over casually. A message preview had appeared on the lock screen. It was from Chloe. And the words were not a casual question about dinner. The words were a wrecking ball. "Last night was incredible," the message read. "I can't stop thinking about you. Counting the seconds until we can be alone again." Time seemed to stop. The knife slipped from Olivia's suddenly numb fingers and clattered onto the cutting board. She stared at the phone, at the glowing white words on the black screen. She read them once, twice, a third time. The words themselves were simple, but they unlocked a secret, horrifying world she never knew existed. Last night, Ethan had told her he was working late at the office to meet a deadline. Her mind, trained to assemble facts, flew backward through the last few months, and suddenly, everything made a sickening kind of sense. The weird moods, the secrets, the glances, the lies. It wasn't a pattern of wrongness. It was a conspiracy. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath her, the solid, reliable world she had built tilting violently on its axis. A wave of nausea washed over her, and she gripped the edge of the counter to keep from falling. Her first instinct was to scream, to smash the phone against the wall, to run upstairs and drag him and her and the whole ugly truth out into the open. But then, something else took over. A strange, glacial calm. The part of her that was a nurse, the part trained to handle trauma, to function in a crisis, took control. Her breathing evened out. Her hands stopped shaking. The chaotic storm of emotion receded, leaving behind a cold, clear, and terrible certainty. She didn't touch the phone. She just stood there in the silent kitchen as the screen went dark again, leaving her alone with the afterimage of the words burned into her vision. A few minutes later, she heard the water shut off upstairs, followed by the sound of footsteps. Ethan came down the stairs, dressed in a clean t-shirt and jeans, toweling his hair. He looked relaxed, refreshed, completely oblivious to the fact that his world had just ended. He walked into the kitchen, a casual smile on his face. "Smells good," he said. "What's for?" He stopped mid-sentence. He saw her face. He saw the unnatural stillness of her body, the look in her eyes. It was a look he had never seen before, a flat, empty, desolate expression, devoid of all the love and warmth he had always taken for granted. "Liv?" he asked, his smile faltering. "Is everything okay?" She didn't answer. She didn't cry or scream or accuse. She simply took a step to the side, revealing the phone on the counter behind her. And then she looked at him, her eyes holding his, and she waited. The silence was absolute. It was the silence of a held breath before a fatal blow. It was the silence of a world broken beyond all repair. He followed her gaze to the phone, and then back to her face. And in that single, shattering moment of understanding, he knew. The lie was over. The game was up. He saw the truth reflected in his wife's dead eyes, and he felt the entire, elaborate, treacherous structure of his life collapse into dust around him. There was no explosion, there was no screaming, no shattering of plates, no storm of accusations. The end of Ethan's world was not a bang, but a profound and terrifying silence. He stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, the sight of his phone on the counter, and the dead, empty look in his wife's eyes holding him in a state of paralysis. Every frantic lie, every possible excuse, died in his throat. The truth was a physical presence in the room, an unmovable object, and it had rendered him completely powerless. The seconds stretched into an eternity. The only sound, the low hum of the refrigerator, a mundane soundtrack to the utter demolition of his life. At that moment, drawn from her room by the oppressive quiet that had replaced the normal sounds of dinner preparation, Chloe appeared at the other end of the hall. She took in the scene in an instant. Olivia, standing like a statue carved from ice. Ethan, pale and horror-struck, the phone lying between them like a black, rectangular tombstone. The color drained from Chloe's face. She knew. Her hand flew to her mouth, a gesture of shock that seemed pitifully inadequate for the magnitude of the disaster. She had walked directly into the blast radius of the bomb they had built together. Olivia's head turned, a slow, robotic movement, until her gaze fell upon her sister. Ethan braced himself for the rage, for the inevitable, sisterly betrayal to be met with a torrent of furious, wounded words. But none came. Olivia looked at Chloe, and her expression was not one of anger, but of a deep, chilling bewilderment. She looked at her sister's face as if trying to recall a name she had long forgotten, as if seeing a complete and utter stranger standing in her home. In that single, vacant look, Olivia lost not only a husband, but a sister, a past, and every happy memory she had ever associated with her. The bond between them, forged over a lifetime of shared secrets and sisterly love, did not just break, it evaporated as if it had never existed. With a calmness that was more terrifying than any rage, Olivia turned back to the counter. She picked up the knife she had dropped. For a heart-stopping moment, Ethan thought she might use it, but she simply used the flat of the blade to scrape the colorful, neatly chopped vegetables, the carrots, the onions, the celery from the cutting board and directly into the stainless steel sink. She turned on the garbage disposal, and the loud, grinding roar that filled the kitchen was the sound of their life together being chewed up and spit away. It was the sound of every dinner they had ever shared, every plan they had ever made, being irrevocably destroyed. When the noise stopped, the silence that returned was even heavier, more final. Olivia wiped her hands on a dish towel, her movements slow and deliberate. She did not look at Ethan. She looked only at Chloe. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was unrecognizable. It was a flat, dead thing, devoid of any inflection, any emotion. It was the voice of a surgeon announcing a time of death. "Get your things," she said, "and get out of my house." The words, "my house," were delivered with a quiet, steely emphasis. A line had been drawn. A territory had been reclaimed. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, a choked, desperate sound escaping her lips. Olivia, I, we. But the words were meaningless. There was nothing to say. There were no explanations, no apologies that could ever bridge the chasm that had just opened up between them. Olivia's dead-eyed stare was unflinching, and Chloe's words died in her throat. She simply nodded, a single jerky movement, her face a mask of shame, and turned to walk back to the room that was no longer hers. Finally, Olivia's gaze shifted to Ethan. The emptiness in her eyes was a void that swallowed him whole. "You too," she said, her voice holding the same dead finality. There was no room for argument, no possibility of appeal. It was a judgment, absolute and eternal. The rest was a blur of numb, mechanical movements. The sound of Chloe's suitcase wheels on the hardwood floor, Ethan walking through the bedroom he had shared with his wife, pulling clothes from the closet, his hands feeling clumsy and disconnected from his body. He was a ghost, haunting the ruins of his own life. They didn't speak another word. They passed each other in the hall like strangers, their shared guilt, a palpable, suffocating shroud. He was the last to leave. He stood for a moment on the front porch, his packed bag heavy in his hand. Through the living room window, he could see Olivia. She was standing in the kitchen, right where he had left her, motionless, staring at nothing. The lights of the house cast a warm, inviting glow out into the twilight, a picture of perfect domesticity. But it was a lie. The house was no longer a home. It was a museum of a life that had just ended, and she was its lonely, heartbroken curator. He turned and walked away, the sound of his own footsteps on the driveway. A lonely, hollow rhythm. There was no resolution, no path forward, no lesson learned in time. There was only the cold, hard fact of the wreckage. He had traded a life of love and stability for a series of feverish, stolen moments, and now he had nothing. There was only the profound, deafening silence that is left when a family is torn apart, and the haunting, empty space where a home used to be.